Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BGC podcast. My name is Jared Callahan, and I'm the CEO and founder of BGC Industry, which is a consulting firm for all things background checks. I'm really excited about today's session. Today's session is on fair chance hiring, and I'm even more excited about the panelists that we have on today, some real experts in the space. First of all, we have Rehana Lerandeau. She's with Checker. We also have Ken Oliver. He's with Prisoners with Children. And first of all, I'd just like the two of you to introduce yourselves and what you do there. So maybe Rehana, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jared. Super happy to be here. Again, my name is Rehana and I'm here with Checker. So at Checker, I'm the Fair Chance Program Manager. What that means is that I help facilitate the sourcing, hiring, and supporting of fair chance talent. Our fair chance talent kind of encompasses a pretty broad range of folks. Our fair chance talent includes people who have criminal records and maybe never served time. We have folks who maybe served a couple of days to a couple of weeks in jail, all the way to talent that has spent decades in prison and this was their first job. So I work culturally to make sure that our talent is supported, has a sense of belonging, and is following their career paths. And then I also help externally find talent that's the right fit for us.
Awesome. Thank you and welcome. Ken, you're up next, sir.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Ken Oliver. I'm the Policy Director at Legal Services for Prisoners with Children. We're a nonprofit organization that's existed for the last 40 years, and we primarily fight policy and advocacy for formerly incarcerated people and their families, and currently incarcerated people. And kind of what that does, it runs the gamut of restoring several of the civil disabilities that have occurred as a result of a felony conviction, including things like ban the box and voting rights, et cetera.
Awesome. Awesome. Cool. Again, thank you both for being a part of this today. And let's just jump right into it. So it's on fair chance hiring. And a lot of folks might know what fair chance is or think they might know what fair chance is, but just from a step back approach, maybe Rehana, we can turn to you first. Can you just kind of walk us through some fair chance fundamentals? What is it? Who practices it? And sort of, so to what? So what? So can you walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'll start off by saying that fair chance language is fairly new in the industry when it comes to these hiring practices. People might have heard more of second chance hiring. The two are pretty interchangeable. It's the idea that folks who have a conviction history or have served time are having access to work, and that we're making sure that we're fairly assessing them for a role that they're qualified for and not unfairly kind of penalizing them for their past history. So that those two words are used in different kind of spheres. I'd say the work that I do with Ken, we see a lot more language around fair chance. It's a lot more empowering. It's a lot more kind of humanizing to the individual. Then we see more in the business sector, and kind of the more old school approach to this is the second chance hiring. I think that for us at Checker, we're pretty intentional about wanting to use fair chance language. We want to acknowledge that a lot of the people that we serve never had a first chance, that they might need a third, fourth, fifth, 10th chance. So that's why we use that language. In terms of what that means from an employer perspective, it's essentially eliminating bias from your process. And from the way that Checker kind of looks at it is that we see our fair chance employment as an extension of our diversity and belonging. So when we're looking at underrepresented groups, we're making sure that we're also looking at talent that has conviction histories. And this isn't a small piece of the pie. There are about 77 million Americans who have a criminal record. So that's a pretty substantial piece of the workforce. So that's sort of how we look at it from a very, very high level in terms of who are the folks, what are we doing, and what language do we use.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you for that breakdown. So I guess if we could kind of pivot to the challenges to reentry, right? So we talked about 77 million folks, as you mentioned. Let's talk a little bit about the challenges for folks that are coming out as far as getting back into society, whether it be housing or employment. And Ken, I'll ask you, maybe you could kind of tell us your story, but also sort of the bigger story of the folks that you represent. If you could just kind of walk us through that.
Sure. A year ago, I was released from a life sentence under California's 3 strikes law for a non-serious, non-violent felony, which I served 24 years. Immediately upon coming home from being incarcerated, I enrolled in school. Initially, I didn't think about entering the job market, but I was offered an opportunity at a nonprofit to do some advocacy and legal work, which I took. And once I got into the nonprofit work and social impact work, I started to come in contact with thousands of people that had been formerly incarcerated and or had felony convictions in California. And there's 8 million people in California that have felony convictions, which is, it's a substantial amount, as Rehana said. And one of the things that I found is they had a couple barriers that blocked them from being, or made it more difficult for them to have successful transition back into the community and be constructive members of the community. The first thing was housing, of course, right? Is that everybody wants a safe place to be able to rest their head and feel safe, and then also be able to go out and carry on their daily business, like finding a job. The second piece to that was that there weren't a lot of opportunities for people out there in society, once they've served their time and they're trying to transition and do the right thing, to actually upskill into positions that were sustainable for them to be able to provide a living for themselves and or their families. Keep in mind that there's approximately 45,000 people a year that are released from prison in California. And as a community, I think that we want everyone to be made whole and everybody to get gainful employment or have some type of legitimate income. It's an issue of public safety. So for me, it became very important. I became very passionate about the issue of being able to help people transition into gainful and sustainable employment. It's not enough now, as we all know, living in the Bay Area and places like Los Angeles, to simply have a job, right? We need to be able to have sustainable careers that allow us to pay mortgages and pay car notes and pay insurance and take care of our kids and do those types of things. And it's really a big challenge for people coming home, men and women, coming home from prison, because there is this bias and stigma that typically attaches a person once they've been incarcerated. And so a lot of the work that I do with companies like Checker and Rehana and others is to try to break down some of those barriers to employment and show that there is a lot of talent and a lot of very good people that have made mistakes. And as Rehana said, I don't think that we want to chastise people in perpetuity for a mistake, because then what happens is we push people on the margins and the fringes, and we cause them sometimes to get into situations that aren't sustainable for them and cost the taxpayers a lot of money. So that's why I do what I do in reference to fair chance hiring.
Awesome. Thank you for taking up that mission. That's amazing. So Rehana, what's your experience been like at Checker as far as the Fair Chance program that you're leading? And full disclosure, I've had the pleasure of working with Rehana for several years, and I know that she's amazing firsthand. In your work, however, outside of Checker, what are other organizations doing? So is the company you work at, Checker, is it sort of one in a million, or are there other companies sort of adopting the philosophies that you folks have there?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think that I'll start by saying that if it weren't for groups like Legal Services for Prisoners with Children and community-based organizations who have been doing this work for decades, we heard Ken saying that LSPC has been around for 40 years. There are tons of community-based organizations all over the country that does the work to try and find employment for our reentry talent. That being said, I think historically, the access to work has been fairly limited to jobs in labor, jobs in retail, hospitality, and the big issue has honestly been the background check. So I think that groups that try and help talent transition back into society and find meaningful work have historically been trying to kind of avoid the background check process altogether. And we've seen work like Ban the Box start to kind of ep away at that, so that we have more opportunities for folks to just broaden their horizons in terms of the type of work that they might want. And that I also want to be really clear that absolutely no shade to any industry or any type of profession, but if labor isn't for you, if retail isn't for you, if hospitality isn't where you want to see your career go, we want people to be picking work that they want, not the work that they think that they can get. So it's been interesting for Checker because we are a background check company. So we're coming at it from a very kind of nuanced place where we're traditionally the barrier. We're traditionally the problem. And that was how our work started, was very organically. We have what we call a candidate experience team over at Checker, and that team is totally dedicated to kind of listening to people's issues who are having the background checks run on them. So in the early days when there was the first 5 to 6 employees, Jared, you might have been one of them on the phones with folks. Our early employees realized how many people were calling in saying that they had been denied access to work based on their record, even if the record was super old, if the record had nothing to do with the job. And luckily, Checker was like, this isn't fair. It doesn't make sense. So we started to build tools into our product to navigate the background check more fairly. And that's how we started, was just like, how can we empower other employers to look at information in a way that's more relevant to the roles and to the candidates. That then kind of morphed into, if we're going to talk the talk, we need to walk the walk. And that's when we started reaching out to groups like LSPC, groups like Project Return, Defy Ventures, all these community-based organizations that have been placing talent into jobs and said, hey, we want to be an employer too. So we built our program based on that organic experience. And we really tried to, sit on the shoulders of these giants who came before us to say like, hey, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to fail at this. Help us erect this program in kind of an untraditional hiring, an untraditional employer focus. Because we, as a corporation, you don't really see that. You don't see talent having access to tech work. You don't really see talent having access to corporate office jobs. So we wanted to be one of the first to really prove that out and give people the opportunity to follow that line of business if that's their thing. There's maybe one or two other folks doing it well, but it's across the board not happening to the scale that it needs to be able to support these 77 million folks that we've discussed.
Got it. Thank you for that explanation. So essentially what we're saying is there's a lot of work to be done. Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was saying that sums it up. Yeah, there's a lot of work.
Yeah, exactly. So Ken, when we first met and we started sort of talking about putting this particular episode together, you threw out a statistic that really jumped out at me, and I don't want to say the number, and I'll ask you to talk about that, but in California, you mentioned, and please forgive me if I misstate this, but a moment ago you mentioned 8 million folks in California are incarcerated. The percentages between the—
Not incarcerated, have felony convictions.
Have felony convictions. Thank you very much for clarification. So the stat that jumped out at me is California is a big state. There's 58 counties here. Tell the folks about the percentages of Southern California and Northern California specifically that really just kind of boggles the mind.
Sure. I think that one of the things that we have to consider as a community, as Californians, is where the density of our incarcerated population comes from. And approximately, according to CDCR's own website, 70%, I think it's like 69.8% of people that get committed to the Department of Corrections come from either Los Angeles County or one of the 4 or 5 surrounding Bay Area counties here in Northern California. And so when you think about that, what happens is upon reentry is people are released from prison back into these metropolises and these places that are very expensive to live. And so several problems start to develop immediately upon a person being released from prison. And as I mentioned earlier, is how do I find sustainable housing? In the Bay Area and places like Oakland and surrounding areas, even for just a 500 square foot, 1-bedroom apartment, you're gonna pay $2,000 if you wanna live in a decent neighborhood that's relatively decent. Same problem in Los Angeles is that the rents are extremely expensive. And so then that begs the question is, if we need to house people, how do we get people employed where they can afford to pay rent and then also pay some of the other things that go in the cost of living, like automobiles, automobile insurance, food, et cetera, and so forth. And so when you really start to look at those numbers, I think I saw a statistic not too long ago that said, even in San Francisco County, you have to make like $40 an hour to even be considered low poverty as far as your wages and as far as your ability to be able to sustain your living. So, what I invite people to do when they think about this issue is understand where our populations come from that are being released from prison, and then 2, how do we position people to where they can become productive members of society rather than being pushed on the fringes and possibly back into the underground economy where it doesn't make the public safe and nobody really wants that to happen. Because the flip side of that is you have a choice as a community member, and that is, do you want your tax dollars going to putting someone in prison for $80,000 a year? And so when you look at the choices of, do I want to spend $80,000 a year to incarcerate somebody for stealing a pack of cigarettes out of a store, or would I rather position them with $5,000 or $10,000 worth of training or education in order for them to become employable in a sustainable way? I think the choice is a no-brainer.
Yeah. And
think if I could
sorry,
just
Rehana, please go
on
ahead. Absolutely.
that really quickly, I think that Ken's framing of employment as public safety is really important. And I think that especially from our perspective as background check industry experts, we are in the business of assessing risk. And so we're experts in navigating the background check and seeing like, okay, is the nature of this crime, the time that's passed, and the nature of the role they're going after so resonant that it proposes a risk. That's one side of the coin, but the other side of that coin is keeping folks out of work detrimental to public safety? And I think the answer is yes. If people cannot do what they need to do to survive, and Ken's kind of named that in California, survival is getting harder by the day in terms of the cost of living. So if we're pushing people into the fringes of society, and if we're pushing people into illegitimate types of work, what does that do for our communities and for public safety? So I think for employers, there's a way of thinking about it as removing bias. There's a way of thinking about it like doing the right thing and restoring honor to folks. And there's also a way of thinking about this as like employment is a public safety issue. And we have to make sure that the 8 million folks who have felony records have access to meaningful work.
That's awesome. That's actually a perfect segue into sort of what Kim was talking about as far as the public safety is concerned. There's clearly a stigma in society, which extends, of course, into hiring and housing. But I want to get back to the whole idea of the benefit to public safety. So, Ken, I don't know if you have like 2 or 3 examples of why is fair chance hiring, and in this case, fair chance housing, a benefit to public safety. We can give folks, 2 or 3 nuggets to kind of hold on to as to this is why it actually benefits the public as far as reentry is concerned.
Right. Well, I think rather than just being framed as a reentry issue, I think it's a human issue when we talk about dignity of work. I mean, I think this country's history has talked about this for 200 or 300 years, is about the dignity of being able to go to work and earn a hard penny, right? And so when you place people in positions, or the only positions that are allowable for people are places where they can't take dignity into the work, meaning at the end of the day getting a paycheck that rewards you for your services and tells you that, not only are you somebody, you are somebody that can move into my community, you can spend dollars on my community, you're paying taxes, and therefore can reap the benefits of what community members reap the benefits from. And so it's just very important to instill hope and to instill dignity in human beings in California. And so we come from this notion typically of retribution, right? And then, I've listened to arguments in Sacramento, oftentimes by very bright people that have law degrees and everything else. They talk about, well, people should continue to get punished. Well, we have a system in this society that talks about that you go pay the state the time for what they say that the crime was, whether you're guilty or innocent sometimes. And when you come out, then that's supposed to be over with. And you're supposed to be able to rebuild your life. Unfortunately, there's this notion of a civil death, right? That's followed us for about 500 years. From England to, if you get convicted of a crime, you're basically civilly dead. And that goes for employment, that goes for tax purposes, that goes for just about every purpose. And so from a public standpoint, who do you want living next to you? Whose family do you want to be next to you as a community member and as a neighbor? Do you want somebody who can't afford to pay their rent and therefore runs the risk of being evicted, or, as Rehana said, getting into illegitimate hustles in order to sustain themselves? And I think it's important. Oftentimes people don't want to go out and commit economic crimes. Typically economic crimes, which represent about 50% of the crimes committed in California, are typically done out of desperation. I mean, people have hit their last rope and they're willing to go pass a bad check. They're willing to go commit a burglary or robbery to steal some property defense to get a quick, $200-300 or whatever it is. And so when you can provide people the opportunity to earn, let me say that, not give it to them, to earn a sustainable living, now a person can come up with a paycheck. They can afford to pay their bills. They can afford to buy their wife, flowers or partner flowers. They can afford to buy their kids, a bicycle. They can afford to put gas in their tank. And now you actually have a dignity in the way that you live on a regular basis. And it causes you not to want to go out and do something illegitimate, because for most people that doesn't really pay, right? We all want a healthy paycheck to be able to take home and put into the bank account. So that's what I would say about public safety. And I think that if the public chooses to take on this narrative or continue the narrative of retribution, it's a lose-lose situation. I mean, I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with the budget process in California, but right now, California spends about $35 billion a year in law enforcement. 14 billion of that is spent on corrections. And that's a cyclical budget that occurs, right? And so when you think about what it costs to lock up a juvenile, for example, $400,000 a year in California, that's a fact. A grown man or woman, $80,000 a year, that's a fact. So how are we spending our resources, and what benefit does that have to us as a community when we constantly isolate people and marginalize people that we know are coming straight back to our community? Right? 95% of the people that go to prison are coming back out. So if we're thoughtful, I think that what we want to do is have people come out as whole as possible, and find out how as a community we can make people whole, provide a soil and opportunity for people to get back on their feet and participate in the community and become good neighbors.
Right. Awesome, Ken. Rehana, please.
I'm sorry, Ken's just dropping all of these nuggets that I have to comment on. I think that budget breakdown is really important too, and thinking through, if we're spending that much on law enforcement and incarceration, what would our communities like if we funneled that money into housing, into public education, into youth organizations, into health? If those funds were moved on the front end to make sure that we have a whole and robust community beforehand, what would that kind of do, setting people up for success in the first place? And then kind of thinking about on the back end of things, what I think what you're describing, Ken, is that like people get a life sentence. When we put people into the system very, very, very frequently, more frequently than any other nation in the world. And I don't believe that the way that goes, that happens to certain marginalized groups is fair or legitimate. And so what are we kind of doing to undo those harms and making sure that people that come out have access to getting back on their feet and that they're not serving a life sentence? And when you were talking, you reminded me of a mentor of mine who I won't mention her name, but we were at a reentry gala with Root and Rebound, and she was talking to me and said that her office got robbed, and they like stole her desk chair, stole a bunch of her stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened to you. And she's like, oh, I'm just glad I don't have that job anymore. And that really struck me as like, well, of course, she was previously incarcerated, and her situation prior to building her own business, starting from scratch and starting to be an entrepreneur to give herself access that was denied her everywhere else, that's what she had to do to live. And so she had so much compassion and empathy and understanding for folks who broke into her office. But this is the reality of a lot of people's situations when we don't give people an opportunity to not just survive, but actually have dignified, meaningful lives. This is kind of the cycle that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, if I can add real quick, Jared, I just want to just chime in on what Rehana said. That's the key word, is opportunity and access. And that's one of the things, that makes Checker and Rehana's work so great, is they've kind of been torchbearers in providing access and opportunity. And I think that what Rehana can probably tell you, I certainly don't want to speak for, is that when you provide people access and opportunity, what you end up with are the most loyal workers, the people that are most dedicated to the job, the people that are most open to learning, the people that are less likely to jump at another offer because you've been loyal to them and actually had faith in them. I mean, I've seen people who've been offered jobs where I work at a nonprofit who literally just by saying, you know what, I think that you're worth, $30 an hour and I'm willing to hire you, break down in tears because no one's ever instilled that type of faith in their humanity. And so, really what you're talking about in many instances are people that have been traumatized, right? It's not that people are just inherently bad or evil or want to do terrible things. People come from disparate circumstances. That's a reality in California. It's a reality in this nation. And I think that we're seeing some of that like bubble up in the country now with what happens with police brutality and everything else. But economic harm and trauma is just as harsh in many cases, right? And it causes people to be traumatized in a way that a lot of us are privileged enough not to have to go through in our lives. And I think that when we extend our humanity and provide people opportunity and belief in them, I think that you see a world of difference in what happens in a community.
Yeah, for sure. And I appreciate you bringing up the numbers point. And actually, it reminds me that there is a section of our conversation today that I am remiss, I forgot to mention. It's almost as if we had this scripted. And that is, I do want to go back a little bit before we transition to the next sort of section in this episode. And Rehana, if you can sort of give us some data points about reentry, about the numbers of folks incarcerated, et cetera, just to give a kind of a big picture of what we're looking at. They're very helpful.
Sure. Yeah. So I think understanding the big picture is important, and that's sort of what brought Checker to take on this work to the degree that we have, is realizing like, okay, we heard these stories firsthand of our customers, folks who they were screening, but the deeper we dug in, we realized, oh, this is a really big societal issue, and us getting this right is important. You know, this is a business solution to a social problem when we're talking about fair chance hiring and fair chance employment. So to kind of talk through what some of those data points are, there are about 2.3 million people who are incarcerated today. And then you kind of go through, this is from the Prison Policy Initiative. I can send you this screenshot. It's a really good graph that says, you know, today there's 2.3 million people who are incarcerated. There are 4.9 million people who were formerly incarcerated who have been since released.
And sorry, that's nationwide, correct?
Nationwide, yeah, that's right. Okay. And then if you talk about people who have ever been convicted of a felony, that extends it to 19 million people. And then if we talk about who just has a criminal record of any kind, we have 77 million people. And then the really important last chunk of this data is to think through what are the ripple effects of all of this? Like what happens and who gets caught up in this? There are 113 million adults who have an immediate family member who's ever been to prison or jail. And I think that's important not only for like the traumas that Ken has described, like the trauma of incarceration, the trauma of being overly policed and criminalized and punished, but what that does for your family economically as well. You know, if you have parents who are, you know, keeping your community afloat and keeping your family afloat, and they're ripped away through the carceral system, what does that do to your family and your communities if there are certain populations that are highly, highly targeted, and thinking about neighborhoods that are highly, highly policed and are then highly incarcerated? What does that do to those communities? And so the devastation and the ripple effects are absolutely astronomical when we look at it in this full picture. And I think that it's important to think through that 113 million people who are directly affected in terms of what if they had access to a steady job and a living wage and secure housing. Those are just two pieces of a much larger puzzle in terms of the social services and access that we should all have as human beings. But I think that we have to think through, where do we need to be pushing our resources? How do we kind of end these cycles of harm? And for me and for Checker, and I think for anyone who's a passionate fair chance employer, it has to start with work. Everything else comes after that, in my opinion.
Awesome. Thanks for walking us through that. So here we are recording this in July of 2020. And our country is in some interesting turmoil, to say the least, right now. So I think it's a timely topic as far as what we're talking about. We see the systemic racism, there's police brutality happening in America. So what I'm hoping we can sort of do is transition the discussion. We are seeing and hearing some people, ordinary citizens, saying, what can I do to make that better? And my hope right now is that we can sort of talk about, what can employers do? So what can hiring organizations do who are aware, at least semi-aware of what's happening and learning and trying to make it better? So let's talk a little bit about what hiring organizations can do to help begin the healing process in our country, quite honestly, just bluntly. And maybe Ken, I'll ask you first, what are your thoughts as far as what can employers do to begin sort of the healing process in our country?
Well, I have a short and a long answer. The short answer is to email Rehana and hire her to develop your curriculum, because the work that she's done the last few years for Checker has been bar none the best in the country. I mean, you know, she does, you know, seminars and conferences all across the country, really changing the narrative for employers, which, you know, it's a black hole that people really don't understand. And Rehana does a great job of explaining that to employers and kind of easing some of the fears and biases, implicit biases that occur when you start talking about somebody with a felony conviction. So that would be the first thing that I would do is seek her advice, because she's the best in the business. That's number one. Number two is have an understanding that it's not just about what employers can do. It's about humanity. It's about empathy. It's about understanding policy in the state and in the country, and then also understanding what do we need to do as a society to get people who've had brushes with the law, justice involved individuals up to speed with skill set development. So we like to look at it as a three-pronged approach. And the first thing that I would tell employers is to be receptive and open to some of the great creativity, some of the great light and work and labor that you can get probably anywhere in the country. It simply is a matter of providing access and opportunity that many people that are incarcerated have not had. And a lot of us take that for granted. But when you get into these areas that are deprived and that are disparate, in many inner cities, you see that people can grow up literally without having access to things that we take for granted on a daily basis. And so it causes stresses and strains. It causes stresses and strains no matter who you are. When you're in certain circumstances, people tend to reach. And like I said, a great majority of the crimes in this country are committed for economic reasons. And so I would first ask employers to have an open mind about the value proposition, right? And I think that if they can start with there and then understand if there is a pathway for me to do this, that's where Rehana comes in. She provides the pathway and the education base and the knowledge base, and then just be open. And then more importantly, like they say in entrepreneurship, just do it and execute it. You know, at some point, you know, you talk about it, you get educated, you get not, but then you just got to dive in. Right. You got to say, you know what, I'm going to create a program. I'm going to hire 1, 2, 3, 4. You fine tune it, you fine tune it, you fine tune it, and then you do like Checker does, and you dedicate 5 or 10% of your workforce to fair chance hires. And I think you'll be in the game.
Got it. Cool. Rehana, your thoughts on what employers can do to, again, start the healing process?
Yeah, well, thank you for the plug, Ken. And I definitely am really excited to try and operationalize what fair chance hiring can look like on a broader scale, because I think from my perspective, the ultimate goal isn't for Checker alone to be the most badass, effective fair chance employer. We won't have succeeded in reaching our mission until fair chance hiring is a normal business practice. The same way that we go after different types of underrepresented groups and try and make sure that they have access to opportunity. We know that diverse organizations are successful organizations. This needs to be a very normal business practice. So I think what people can start to do to start on that journey and the healing process is make a commitment. Just make a commitment starting off. And I think that for fair chance employment to work really well, we're looking for a total business transformation, but it's small tweaks to your existing system can get you to a place where you can hire, sustain, and retain top talent that are fair chance, people with conviction histories or people who are previously incarcerated. I think that also, you know, I want to echo that kind of what Ken was alluding to and talking about building empathy and understanding. I agree. I also am super tired of only hearing that side of the story. I'm tired of hearing what these folks have to do to transform themselves to get access to opportunities. And it's time for businesses to take responsibility and understand that we are the ones that are keeping people out of work. It's not that people aren't skilled up. It's not that people aren't ready. It's not that people haven't served their time. They've done the work. And businesses need to move into a place where it's our turn to do the work. And we're also legally obligated to do the work. So I think that there is this idea that people would love to be a fair chance employer if it weren't for, you know, insert vague line about the legal implications. There are actually far more issues that you need to navigate as an employer to make sure that you are not being discriminatory than there are kind of making sure that you have these very intense practices that screen people out. So if you have blanket bans on felonies, if you have blanket bans on certain charge types, you might actually not be working within the laws passed to protect this talent. So I think that there's a lot that we have to do. And the first is to understand, like, what are you legally obligated to do? And I say that not to try and come off as, you know, threatening or anything, but I think that one of the main things that people have to do that they come to me to ask about is like, how do I convince my employer? Like, I'm really passionate about this, but how do I make it happen? Compliance is a really good first step. Are you maintaining compliance? Because there are actually quite a few things that you need to make sure that you're covering to keep your business safe. So that's a really good first toe into it. And from there, like Ken said, just start. Hit up Center for Employment Opportunities, Defy Ventures, America Works, Health Right 360. There are dozens of organizations that have talent. When Checker started, we started with an internship that was run by a volunteer committee. And now 5% of our full-time employees are fair chance or reentry. We did not know what we were doing, but we were like, we're just gonna, we have to try this. We failed many times and we just didn't stop. So I think that taking that first step and making a commitment to try is not only a responsibility that we all have in terms of the work that we have to do to transform as businesses, but this doesn't need to be intimidating. You don't need to hire someone full time. You can call me and Ken and we'll coach you through it, but just take a step, hire one person and watch how your organization transforms, and it will just happen naturally.
Yeah, that's awesome. And really, we've gone from kind of a broader what can employers do to now we're starting to get into the specifics, and keeping in that sort of vein of thought, Rehana, you and I, again, talked previous to our podcast today, and the term I think that you came up with was a full and complete opportunity. And maybe just hoping you can sort of define what that looks like and feels like.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. So I think at Checker, we try and provide a full and complete opportunity for folks. And what that means is that we look to lower the barrier, not the bar. So we're lowering the barrier to employment, but we are not lowering the bar on our expectations of our talent. So even if we take someone who's been incarcerated for 30 years and has never used a MacBook before, we want to give them the opportunity to ramp up and see them hit that bar so that they're performing on par or outperforming their peers. So we want to make sure that we're taking on folks who are ready for the work, and that once we take people on, that they're a member of our community and they have absolutely equal rights to everybody else. So I've seen some pretty disheartening and upsetting practices in fair chance employment where people are saying, oh yeah, we'll bring this person on, but they don't get the same access to all of the information that their peers do, or we're gonna sit them next to security, which is just disgusting in my mind. Or they have to be continuously monitored. If you're taking on talent and if you're doing an individualized assessment, you're saying that you trust this person and you're making a decision saying this person has proven that they're ready to work. And now on our end, this person is just a checker. I have people who have talked about their past history because it's such a big part of them, and they want to share it, and they want to have their community know what they've gone through, and they want to be a mentor and a guide. I have other folks who do not want to talk about it. They just want to get their life on, a different path and be able to be in community with their peers, and they want to be known for being really, really good at their job. And that's their right. So I'd say that when you're a fair chance employer, don't put people on a pedestal. Don't give them a limited or incomplete opportunity. You're really hiring talent to join your community, and that opportunity should be full and complete.
I love it. Yeah, thank you for that definition. And then, sorry, go ahead, Ken. I was gonna pivot to you, but if you want to jump in now, go right ahead.
Go ahead. My mistake. I just wanted to chime in on what Rehana said. I think, it's important for us to think about words like restoration in this process and what it means to restore people whole. And Rehana talked about people continuing the practices of systemic racism and systemic discrimination, which the key word to that is marginalizing people and groups. And I think that if we're ever to get away from systemic and structures of racism that harm people, we have to get away from marginalizing people, including people that have felony convictions. And when you go into a workplace and people say, okay, I'm gonna hire this person as a charity case, not take them for face and whole value, and I'm going to give them access to less information. I'm going to pay them less, which I've seen. I'm going to, give them less benefit. I'll give you this, but I'm not going to give you that. It's like kind of a hedge bet. I think that you're continuing the very structures that we're all fighting against, right? And so you can turn a good deed into a continuation of something that has plagued this country for about 400 years. So I think it's important for us to understand what restoration means, and that means giving every person a fair and level playing field. And I think when you do that, there's something magical that happens with people that have been marginalized, is you start to see a pride and a dignity and a self-awareness and a self-esteem that really, really brings this whole process forward full-fledged, you know, and I think it's just important for us to keep that in mind when we talk about these processes, is restoring wholeness to human beings and individuals. And it makes it, again, I hate to keep harping on it, but it makes not only our community better, it makes it safer.
Right, right. Yeah, I think it's important to harp on it, so don't apologize for that. And much like Rehana talks about the full and complete opportunity, Ken, something that struck me when we first talked is sort of the all-encompassing term of the fair chance to be successful, right? And you and I talked about how folks that are on parole don't have voter rights. So maybe you can kind of talk the audience through what it means to you and to those folks that are entering to have that fair chance to be successful. What does it look like?
Absolutely. Well, I think number one, to Rehana's point, I certainly don't want to discourage any particular industry. I mean, every industry needs workers, and so that's great. But I think the way that I frame it, the way that I look at it is the work that I'm doing able to sustain me in just a regular, decent lifestyle to keep me away from things that, you know, may tempt me to do something else to put gas in my car, right? And so for me, what that looks like is providing people access to training, providing people access once they've had the training to the same type of jobs that anybody else can get, whether it's you or Rehana or anybody else. I think not punishing me for something I've already continuously paid for over and over and over again. And I would be remiss, and I want to say this earlier, this does not marginalize or minimize anything that any victim has gone through. And it's important for me to say that, because I entertain arguments all the time in Sacramento with our legislature. And the first thing that they bring up when you talk about giving people rights that have actually exited prison and served their time is they go back to this narrative of you still have to pay, and that the victims are still paying. There's no doubt that victims of crime have been traumatized for serious and violent felonies, even property crimes. If your house is broken into, that's a form of trauma, right? But as mature community members, I think at some point we have to be able to say, how do we benefit as a community? We benefit as a community, continue this retribution type of narrative and thought process, and we're going to continue to punish people. What is the result of that? Right? We have to do dialectical thinking. What is the result of me continuing to punish this person once they've already served their time? Now I'm going to tell them you can't be part of the community. I don't think that you deserve a job. I don't think you deserve X, Y, Z. Now, what is that person going to do as a result of that? Chances are, if there's no love, there's no community, there's no inclusion, then that person is pushed back out to the fringes, and now they're going to pick up drugs, or they're going to do something else probably harmful, and they're not going to have a lot of self-esteem or care. They turn into a nihilist, so to speak. They're not going to really care about their own future, and they're going to continue to do stuff that puts them back in. And then the cycle, as Rehana mentioned, just continues and continues and continues. It's just not smart policy. We did that with the 3 strikes law in the 90s, and then we thought that was cute for 15 years. Then we said, oops, oh, that costs a lot of money. Let's change course. And now we went into this other course. That's not sound public policy. What sound public policy is restoring human beings and trying to bring everybody in a DEI strategy from a community perspective rather than just a workforce perspective. Like, how can we include as many marginalized community members as possible, make them whole, make them feel inclusive, and I think you get a better community as a result. It's been proven over and over and over again. In reference to voting, that's one piece of restoring people, right? And so currently we're involved with Prop 17 in November, which is to restore voting rights for people that have served their time. It's important for me to say that, again, because people still think that parole is part of the time. It's not. Once you've served your time, you're out, you're under supervision, you're in a transitional period back into the community. But if a person like myself is working, I've worked full time since I've been home. I pay a whole lot in state taxes. I've been law abiding. I do what I'm supposed to do in reference to expectations. I should, as a community member, be allowed to exercise my voice, right? I should be able to talk about and have conversations about and even vote about laws that affect my life. I should be able to talk about the district attorney races that are going to determine the future of what happens in a criminal or civil case. I should be able to vote for sheriffs when they're out there killing people and not doing anything about it. So, restoring the voice of people in this country has been one of the cornerstones of this country, is being able to vote. So we think all of those civil disabilities have to be restored, because that's how you make people whole. That's how you make people feel like they're a part of what we're doing every day. And ultimately, when people feel a part of something, they typically don't like to go against the grain and commit harm to the things that they feel a part of. It's when they don't feel a part that typically they stop caring because people have stopped caring about them.
Right. I mean, dusting off my old American history book over here, I believe, you know, in America, it's a representative democracy, right? And so folks that are getting out, if they're, like you said, going back to work and paying their taxes, and their taxes are also supposed to be representative of the community, but they don't have that legal right to vote, it really is a contradictory position, I would think.
Well, if we think about transformation and we think about, okay, we want people to come out and do the right thing, but it's like we want you to come out and do the right thing, but almost, right? We want you to do that without a voice. Like we want you to work, we want you to pay taxes, we want you to do all the stuff that everybody else is doing, but we want you to sit over there in the corner and be quiet. And that doesn't send a message of inclusion, right? And so when you're not sending a message of inclusion, you're just talking about inclusion, you know, that creates all type of contradictions that are muddy and muddy the water. So I think just as a practical, wholehearted restorative community, and then I'm talking about Californians, we have to embrace humanity, we have to embrace people, and we have to include people in the things that we do. And that includes people that have made mistakes and went to prison. Even in the cases of murder, which is hard for a lot of people to swallow, there are a lot of heinous crimes that occur. When violent crimes occur, typically those people are the least of people that are going to recidivate in the state of California. And we have to understand that what you did in 19 shouldn't define you when you're 40 or 35 or 50. And that once you've paid the separation or exile from community, from your family, from all the things that we take for granted every day, you should have a right to restore your life and kind of make yourself whole, and then also be able to make the community whole by your contribution via taxes and everything else through that process. To not do so is not only barbaric, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot every single day when we take an opposite approach.
Well, and we're saying that there's no chance for transformation, right? Like, we need to believe that folks have the ability and the tools to transform. And if we continue on the cycle of punishment, that's saying I'm going to punish you forever, whether it's with incarceration, whether it's a really long period of parole, whether it's, you know, not having equal access to housing and jobs. We're signing this person up to whatever they did is going to define them for the rest of their life. And that's not giving any opportunity for transformation. And what does that do to a person's livelihood? And also, how does that then encourage a person to re-enter society and be able to be a part of their community? We make it absolutely impossible if we don't separate the idea of consequences versus punishment. And when harm occurs, there's often consequences associated with it. And I was so glad that you brought up, kind of, not to minimize the victims, but how do we kind of work through and move through those consequences? And maybe those consequences are restorative justice practices. And we have friends and allies at Restore Justice that do just that. It's a group of previously incarcerated folks led by Adnan Khan. And they bring together families of victims and the people who committed the harm, and they actually do restorative justice practices. I think that would be so much more useful than continuing to punish people for what they did indefinitely. It doesn't serve our economy, it doesn't serve our community, and I don't really think it serves our healing either.
That's an awesome thought there. So believe it or not, we're up against it. I could talk about this with you guys for hours. This has been fantastic. I do want to sort of wrap and get some final thoughts here. So to you, the audience, you know, we've talked through what fair chance sort of fundamentals are. We've talked about some challenges to reentry. We've talked a little bit about the data that's behind it all. Talk about some specific and general calls to actions. But as we wrap, consider this. So when someone gets out of prison or jail, we can either continue, as Rehana and Ken have talked about, sort of this perpetuation of the cycle of recidivism, or we can end what I would kind of call this second life sentence. And that's really what society, unfortunately, has given folks, is a second life sentence. They've done their time based upon a judge and or jury of their peers. But again, society is offered that second life sentence, unfortunately. So what can we all do? As we wrap, again, my suggestion to folks is, like Ken said, you can actually reach out to me, and I'll put you in contact with Rehana if you'd like to, or Ken if you'd like to. I have participated in some of the Rehana-led reentry simulations, and I can tell you that it's very, very powerful. And the biggest walk away in those reentry simulations to me is that it really does connect the employers that are participating in it with the sort of point of view of reentry folks. It really gives a good connection. Again, you can't peer into exactly what their lives are like and exactly what they're feeling, but it gives you kind of a touch and a taste of what they've gone through and what they're experiencing as they're trying to get back out there and be contributing members of society. So what I'd like each of you to do, if you could, is just give me a minute or two, the audience a minute or two of sort of final thoughts before we wrap on Fair Chance, what it means to you, and what you hope employers will take away from this. And maybe Rehana, we'll start with you.
Sure, yeah. So much good stuff has been said today, and as always, I really appreciate collaborating with you both. I think, what does fair chance employment mean to me? I just think that this work is so critical. I think that I not only, have just personal connections of so many people who are my mentors, who are my colleagues, who are my allies, who are my friends, who are previously incarcerated. And when they tell me just what they went through in terms of just being incarcerated in general, I mean, the strength that takes to survive that is, I don't have words, obviously, to kind of describe how that makes me feel. So the idea of this second life sentence for this folks is just unacceptable in my mind. It's deeply unacceptable. And I think that there is an emotional side to it, an empathetic side to it, and a side to it about doing the right thing. But there's also, I feel, a keen sense of responsibility as a person who works for an organization that is participating in the employment process. And I'd want to challenge listeners to think through, the uncomfortable truth that if y'all aren't thinking about this, you're not doing enough. And we all have a responsibility to, at first just educate yourself. Coming to this podcast is a great first step, but we as people in the employment world, we have a responsibility to right the wrongs of decades of poor policy, decades of criminalization, decades of harm in people's lives just wasted inside cages. So I think that this is an urgent calling. It's something that I don't see a choice in. I think that we have to figure out the best way forward, and we need everyone to participate.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Ken, your final thoughts here.
Sure. I would just invite the audience to understand the historic moment that we're in as a country, and understand, and I didn't say this earlier, but understand the makeup, the racial makeup of our carceral system in the United States and in California specifically. California is a place now that's a majority of people of color. Our prison population is 80% people of color. And so when you think about marginalization of communities, multiply that times 2 or 3, or maybe 10, when you talk about somebody having a felony conviction on top of already being marginalized, right? And so when we look at what things that employers and people can do in this moment, again, I mean, I don't, want to put too much butter on it, but getting with people like Rehana who can walk you through the process, getting with people like me who are able to be a liaison if you're uncertain or it's uncharted territory for you, there are people that can walk you through the process. And I would invite you as an employer to just take one person. Start off with just taking one person. Support that person, and support that person in upskilling. Support that person in doing the work. Be patient with that person as they come back in, because as Rehana said, some of the brightest and smartest minds are people that made mistakes and are behind prison walls. That's a fact. I know that from personal experience. I met Rehana in one of those circumstances. I'm sure she can attest to the fact that she's met some brilliant people, and she works with people that are brilliant in many respects. So I would just invite us in this moment to take a step forward and make something happen. Don't wait for it. The tools are here. The people are here. The talent is here. And if you want to make a contribution, and maybe you're caught up in work, working 60 hours a week, and you can't get out in the streets and do a protest, or you can't get out in other kind of ways, you can support and you can make a difference by hiring one person and instilling in that person the dignity of humanity and the dignity of work, and allow that person to put the pieces back of their own lives, and then also contributing to the community, which in my work, I find that when you take people and you provide them a tremendous opportunity, their willingness to give back is so huge. That's all they talk about is service. How can I help the kids? How can I go over here and help pass out groceries? How can I put together kits to pass out to somebody who's less needy? I mean, who needs more help? And so, I think that's how you move this thing forward, is just practicing reciprocity and taking initiative.
Awesome. Well, I'd like to thank you both, not only for participating in today's podcast, that's certainly appreciated, but more importantly, I appreciate your professionalism and your passion about what it is you're doing and moving the needle forward in the discussions, but more importantly, the actions of Fair Chance. Also, I'd like to thank all of you for listening and watching. I would encourage you to share this amongst your colleagues within your organizations, share it in your social media circles. So again, thank you to Ken, thank you to Rehana, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you, Jared.